Later years would teach London to regard the matter as one more oddity in the crowded museum of metropolitan crimes, but those who were touched by it, Lady Agatha Vance, Inspector Lestrade, the trembling sexton of St. Cuthbert's, never spoke of it without a lowering of the voice, as though the very words must pass softly under a funerary arch. For it was a whisper, a mere thread of sound, at a cemetery gate that set the whole affair in motion and drew Sherlock Holmes from the indolence of a wet March afternoon into the most chilling puzzle that ever turned his grey eyes keen. The day had closed upon a rank fog that pushed its greasy fingers against the panes of Baker Street. Dr. Watson, who had lately resumed his practice in Kensington, nevertheless found himself, as he often did, in those intervals when conscience allowed an old soldier to idle, seated in his accustomed chair by the fire at number 221B. He was warming his hands, for the streets had the damp chill that goes through a man's coat as a knife goes through milk. Opposite him lounged Holmes, one lank leg flung over the other, his dressing-gown roped about him like a monk's habit. The Persian slipper that housed his tobacco had strayed onto the mantelpiece, and the blue wreaths of his pipe curled to the ceiling with that air of philosophic resignation which in him took the place of mere patience. If the peace of that snug room was disturbed, it was not by the rattle of cabs or the distant bark of a barrack-yard drill, but by a sudden violent knocking below, after which Mrs. Hudson's thin protest climbed the stair in disjointed syllables. The door opened, without ceremony, to admit a lady wrapped in mourning. No fashionable pretence but the heavy crape and dull jet which declares grief rather than displays it. She was tall, of that austere beauty which sorrow chisels rather than mars, and her veil, lifted back in agitation, revealed eyes of an arresting pallor. They were the eyes of one who has gazed too long upon a single frightful thought. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said without preamble, "I have been told—" Here her composure failed, and she steadied herself with a gloved hand upon the edge of the table. "I beg you to forgive me. I am Lady Agatha Vance, of Onslow Square." Holmes had risen. His bow, when it came, was less a courtesy than a diagnostic, for I saw his gaze move like a surgeon's probe over her figure, the rain-spattered hem that belied the carriage waiting below, a smear of iron rust near the right glove, and the faint, shimmering line upon the veil where a single drop had cut a clear channel through black gauze. "Pray be seated, Lady Agatha," said he. "You have come from St. Cuthbert's in Briar Lane. The fog is worse there by the canal. Your coachman waits in a hired fly, Jobson's, by the crimson tassel on your cord. You have been to the churchyard." She obeyed him mechanically, her lips parting in astonishment. "I had been told you observe much," she murmured, "but—" "Observation is merely the courtesy we owe to facts," Holmes returned. "Dr. Watson will favour us with the fire. Your hands are cold as coins." She warmed them obediently, yet her gaze never left Holmes's face. "It is the strangest thing," said she at last, and the words came with the fearful haste of one who must outpace her imagination. "My husband, Sir Bertram Vance, has lain for a fortnight in the family vault at St. Cuthbert's. There is nothing unusual in that, alas, but this evening at 6, a half-hour after the verger was gone, a voice addressed me from the Lich Gate." "The Lich Gate," I repeated, for the old churchyard, with its peaked shelter of oak and iron, has always struck me as a picturesque relic rather than a theatre for crimes. "A whisper," she said, and shivered. So close to my ear that I felt the hairs rise, though there was no person near me. It said, "The sleeper keeps his debt. Ask the ferryman." Holmes had resumed his chair, but I saw his profile sharpen like a blade at a whetstone. "You were alone?" My maid had fallen back. She is a timid creature. The sexton had left his keys with me earlier to be returned to the vicar in the morning. I stood no 5 paces from the gate. I looked to right and left, behind and before. There was not a soul in the path, Mr. Holmes. The hour, you say, was 6. The fog had fallen. Thick as wool, it muffled the lamps and flattened every sound. That made the whisper. Oh, it made it unnatural. I could not place it. It was as if the words were made in the air itself. Holmes tapped the stem of his pipe once against the grate. And then? Then I heard the bell of St. Cuthbert's strike the quarter. I fled. I am not a coward, but the cemetery, my husband, Mr. Holmes, forgive me. You have been singularly frank, and it is in frankness that danger may be most quickly apprehended, said Holmes. You spoke of a sexton, of keys, and of your late husband. What debt has the sleeper kept, and who is this ferryman? Lady Agatha's gloved hands interlaced in her lap. There is no debt that I know. Sir Bertram was exact in his accounts. As for a ferryman, only the poet's fancy for death, and yet— She swallowed. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard called upon me this morning about a small matter concerning Sir Bertram's papers, his safe deposit at the Lombard Bank, which is sealed until probate. I told him what I could, but now I fear there is some dreadful business around my husband's rest. Did you observe anything else at the gate? Holmes asked, without inflection. A scent, perhaps, or a stain upon the iron? The question, so odd in the moment, unnerved her afresh. A scent? She closed her eyes as if recalling a room by memory. Yes, now you fix it in my mind. Not the rich reek of tallow from the lanterns, nor the damp of earth. Something sharper, carbolic perhaps. I smelt it in the hospital when my sister was ill. Holmes nodded once, almost imperceptibly. And the iron? There were beads of moisture upon the scrollwork. Oh, this is foolish. The lower hinge was newly oiled. I brushed my glove there and marked it with a smear. That is the rust you saw. Holmes permitted himself the ghost of a smile. It is not foolish to furnish the truth with small hinges. They swing large doors. At this there came again a shuffle upon the stair, and in swept Inspector Lestrade Tiddy-too, who halted upon the threshold with his hat in his hand and his mouth already prepared to contest whatever we had not yet said. He stopped dead at sight of Lady Agatha, and his manner softened. "My lady, Mr. Holmes, doctor." He bobbed a general salutation. "Beg your pardon for the liberty, but there's been an occurrence at St. Cuthbert's." "An occurrence?" I exclaimed. "A man found dead within the churchyard by the Vance vault," said Lestrade, smoothing his moustache in a manner I had seen in him when a case took a step into the dark. "The gate locked and the key in the vestry, as it should be. No sign of entry or egress. The verger's lad found him at 7:30 when he came back for a prayer book he'd left. As neat a puzzle as ever you please, Mr. Holmes, if one cared for puzzles at such a time." Lady Agatha caught at the back of the chair. Who is it?" "Name of Elias Prout, sexton's assistant. A steady fellow. No enemies that anyone can name, and nothing taken. We've a doctor on the way to certify, but I'll tell you plain, it looks like the life's been frightened out of him. No marks, not one." Holmes rose. The transformation in him from indolent scholar to man of action never failed to astonish me. He reached for his coat and violin case. No, not the violin case, I corrected myself with a start. It was that other flat case I had seen him use on rare excursions containing lenses, a measuring tape, a strip of thin cord, and a little folding glass vial with a stopper. "Lady Agatha," said he, "will you favour us by returning to Onslow Square until I send a message? Inspector, you will procure a cab. We will go at once to St. Cuthbert's." Lestrade lifted an eyebrow. "You think it murder, then?" "I think," Holmes answered, drawing on his gloves, "that the dead, when properly questioned, sometimes speak more clearly than the living, and I fancy that St. Cuthbert's Gate has a tongue." The cemetery lay off Briar Lane, where the canal goes sluggish under a filth of smoke and the gas lamps set honeyed islands in a sea of fog. The bell tower of St. Cuthbert's rose like a darker smear against that grey, and under it the lich gate crouched, its peaked roof dripping steadily upon the flags. Two constables paced like phantoms, and a cluster of curious souls pressed against the outer railings until a barked command from Lestrade sent them scuttling. Within the yard, near a low row of headstones, a shape lay upon a tarpaulin. Holmes did not go to it at once. He stood beneath the gate instead, head tilted, the forefinger of his right hand touching his chin. He inhaled once, delicately, like a man assessing a wine. "Carbolic," he murmured. "And paraffin. Curious to find them in company." His gaze fell upon the hinge. "New oil, as Lady Agatha observed, yet impurities in it. Coal dust, perhaps. Inspector, a lantern." Lestrade handed him one. Holmes stooped and held the light close to the lower hinge. "Watson," he said, "favour me." I knelt, and he guided the lantern so that its beam washed across a thread so fine it would have escaped any but the most diligent searcher. It linked the hinge to the inner upright, as a spider ties its world to a blade of grass. "Silk," Holmes observed. "Crimson, and so slender that it is almost a hair. See where it is frayed? It has carried a weight and parted as a lover parts a curtain." "What in heaven's name—" began Lestrade, but Holmes had moved to the flagstones just within the gate and was now on his knees. "A smear here," he said softly. "Blue upon grey, indigo wax, no, not wax precisely. A composition, tallow tinted for the stage or the printing house. And this, Watson?" He held up a match no larger than a child's finger, its yellow head crushed at the edge and streaked with a thin black smear. "A vesta," I ventured. "Struck against a shoe, perhaps, or the ironwork." "Against a surface treated with carbolic," said Holmes, and the lantern showed the gleam in his eyes. "One would use such a treatment to cleanse and to remove scents." Lestrade's glance went towards the tarpaulin. "And the poor devil?" Holmes drew back the covering with a tenderness that I had learned to read as respect, not for the man so much as for the evidence his body bore. Elias Prout's face, under the lantern's unkind light, wore the slack surprise of sudden extinction. His mouth gaped slightly, his hands were clenched into half-formed fists as if he had reached for something and found air. "Watson," said Holmes, "if you please." I examined the body as best I could upon cold stones. "No contusions," I reported after a moment. "No bruising at the lips to suggest suffocation. The pupils, pinpointed, yet no odour upon the breath, save the faintest whiff. What is that? Something tarry?" "Coal gas," said Holmes, "but here in the open, unless—" He rose as abruptly as he had knelt, his gaze flashing to the oak door of the Vance vault, upon which damp had drawn sullen patterns. "Inspector, who has the key?" "The vicar, sir," said Lestrade. "And he doesn't give it out save to the family?" Holmes's finger traced the keyhole. He sniffed again, not at the iron, but at the air that exhaled faintly from the seam between door and stone. "Carbolic," he repeated. "And something else, paraffin. Yes, and an absence that is itself a presence." "Meaning what?" said Lestrade. "Meaning, my dear Inspector, that where there ought to be the ancient smells of a vault, earth, old wood, mould, and a touch of decay, there is a cleanliness that offends by its very exactness." His voice had taken on that dry, indifferent tone which in him marked the arrival of interest. Someone has been careful, too careful where care is not customary. He returned to the gate then, and his long fingers delicately plucked at the frayed silk. This filament has been cut by friction under tension. The hinge is newly oiled, badly, its grit shows haste. The match head is crushed at a curious angle. The whisper, Lady Agatha tells us, spoke of a debt kept and a ferryman, and a man is dead within a locked yard with no sign that any creature greater than a cat passed the bars. Lestrade stirred the tarpaulin with the toe of his boot. "Are you suggesting the gate murdered him, Mr. Holmes?" "I suggest nothing," said Holmes, his eyes on the crest of the lich gate, where dark beams crossed and the fog made of the space between them a pale blank. "I only listen. And just now, Inspector, the gate whispers again." We all stood still, though there was no sound but the beat of the fog upon the oak and the distant murmur of the canal. I saw in Holmes's face that expression, not expectancy but recollection, that foretold he had seized upon some association. Then he turned to Lestrade with such sudden energy that the inspector started. "You will have the vicar roused and the vault opened at once," Holmes said. "No man dies so tidily without an object, and you will keep Lady Agatha under guard in her house tonight, politely, if you can, but closely, for she stands nearer to this business than she knows." "Nearer?" Lestrade repeated. "How so?" Holmes's gaze went to the inner edge of the hinge, where the silk had abraded to a powder finer than dust. He lifted a few red grains upon his fingernail and held them to the lantern light. "Because, Inspector," he said quietly, "there are whispers a man may throw from 100 feet and make them sound within a woman's ear, and there are debts a sleeper may be made to keep. The dead, as I remarked, can be made to speak. The question that remains is, who taught them, and why?" He let the red powder fall, straightened, and the fog swallowed the delicate cascade as though it had never been. "We shall know more when the vault yawns," he added. "Until then, we are at the gate of the problem, not yet within." Holmes's words proved prophetic, for when at last the vicar came running with his keys, and the iron groaned upon its hinges, the breath that issued from the Vaunt's vault was as clean as a hospital corridor, and in that cold, scrubbed air lay the first true token of the deception, small as a coin, and twice as valuable. Holmes did not touch it then. He only looked, and the faintest smile, cold and secretive, travelled across his mouth like a shadow over snow. "Watson," said he, "pray observe and remember, for if I mistake not, that trifle will hang a very ingenious man, or save him if he be cleverer still." The vicar's trembling hand had scarcely turned the second ward when the iron door gave with a sigh of long habit, and that lifeless, purified breath issued out to meet us. Lestrade held up his lantern. The walls within were whitewashed to a scouring brightness unusual in such repositories, and the very flagstones had been swabbed till the pores were shut like the skin of a drowned man. Holmes did not advance more than 2 paces. His gaze fell not upon the oaken shell that held Sir Bertram, but upon the step itself, where a tiny disc no larger than a shilling lay by the jamb, as if some careless hand had let it roll from palm to stone. He did not stoop. With the folded blade of his pocket-knife, he flicked the little object clear of the damp and into his waiting handkerchief. "We will spare the clergy the scandal of kneeling to their dead," he murmured, and made a small parcel of his prize. The vicar, poor soul, crossed himself in an Anglican fashion that betrayed the man rather than the church. "What have you there, Mr. Holmes?" asked Lestrade. "A question stamped upon brass," Holmes returned. He slipped the parcel into his inner pocket and, still without looking closely at it, turned to the coffin. There was no mark of violence upon the oaken lid, no recent gouge or tool score. But where the pawl would have rested, a faint ring, lighter than the surrounding clean, suggested that some small object had lately lain atop and been removed before our coming. "A coin has stood here for a little while," said he. "Long enough to ghost its shape upon the carbonized surface, not long enough to allow the damp to reclaim it." The vicar found his voice. "Sir Bertram's widow visited yesterday. She brought flowers, nothing else." "I cannot answer for any token, indeed. I would have noticed." "You would have noticed what you expect to see," Holmes replied, without unkindness. "Few men notice an absence. Pray lock up again, sir. Until the coroner grants authority, we do not touch the rest." The key turned. We came out once more beneath the dripping gate. Holmes's attention, which had seemed diffused like the fog, tightened again to a thread. He mounted the low bench built into the inner face of the lich gate, lifted the lantern to its black rafters, and studied the cross-bracing. "Ah," he said softly, and I heard in that exhalation the satisfaction of a sportsman who has at last glimpsed his quarry's ear in the bracken. "Watson, your shoulder." I braced myself beneath him while he reached with long, deft fingers to the meeting of two beams. When he descended, his handkerchief held a round of thin tin, with a central hole no bigger than a tailor's goose coin, and the barest scrap of crimson silk still knotted through it. The tin was stained where some simple pigment had been rubbed across, the same indigo hue we had seen ground into the hinge. "A child's toy," said Lestrade, peering. "And yet I suppose you will tell me that London may hang by a child's toy if the knot be clever enough." "London, no," said Holmes, "but a single message, yes. A taut filament passing from this diaphragm to the inner hinge, the ironwork serving as a frame, a whisper spoken from a distance along its fellow thread, and the gate itself becomes a mouth. The silk has parted, you see, where the tension was greatest. They tried it more than once." He nodded at the frayed ends. "We are dealing not with phantoms, but with acoustics, and an operator who thought to cleanse his theatre afterwards." Lestrade stared at the dark lane beyond the railings. "Spoken from a distance, how far?" "With silk of this gauge and the night as a conspirator, 100 feet, more if art assists. Note the canal." He gestured, and the lantern showed the glimmer of that sluggish ribbon beyond the low wall. "The water will carry a voice under a culvert better than any postboy. A man could ensconce himself in the shadow of those pilasters, pass his line through, and make the gate murmur like a sibyl." "A nice trick to frighten a lady," Lestrade admitted grudgingly. "But Elias Prout, what of him? He was no lady." Holmes's eyes had gone to the assistant's body again. "The pupils, Watson?" "Contracted," I said. "There is the tarry odour I noted." "Coal tar," Holmes mused. "But also, did you catch the faint pear-drop note?" "No." "You will when the air is still." The composition he inhaled was not coal gas alone. Prout carried no lamp, and yet a vesta has been struck hard by the gate. He was lured here by a signal, the whisper perhaps, leaned in, and took into his lungs an exhalation prepared for him. When the thing overcame him and he fell, the air from the vault would do the rest. No telltale scent of decay, nothing to offend but an unnatural cleanliness. He turned the lantern upon the hinge once more. "Our man scrubbed his stage, Inspector. Honest men do not scour a grave." The constables shifted uneasily. Lestrade's practical mind, I could see, was already setting names upon this framework. "This business about a debt and a ferryman? What say you to that, Doctor? Sounds like Charania and his obol tuang. A widow, money, a vault. One could write the end without troubling the beginning." An attractive conclusion, Holmes observed dryly, for those who like their endings supplied by the printers in advance. Lady Agatha is to be protected, not suspected, until we possess facts. The whisper mentions a ferryman. The trifle in the vault bears upon that. If it be what I believe, we shall have a path down river before the night is out. At this he at last unfolded his handkerchief and let the lantern fall upon the small disk. It was of brass, slightly oval, with a perforation by which it might be strung, and stamped upon one face with a crude device of oars and the word ferry in block letters, and below it, poorly struck, Limi. On the reverse was a number 37, and the faintest smear of blue about the rim, as if some pigmented grease had been thumbed across it. "A ferry cheque," said Holmes, "issued to regulars who pay in advance. I have seen their like at Blackwall and Greenwich. This one smelt of the same carbolic we have here until I folded it. Our man handled it when his gloves were not entirely free of his cleansing liquor." Lestrade grunted. "If he came by water, that points us to boatmen. Half the rogues in Limehouse have oars." "And half the honest men," Holmes returned. "We will not net a district because one fish is sly." He slipped the token back into his pocket. "What we require now is the negative of a picture, not the picture. Who expected Elias Prout to be here at 7:30? Who knew the vicar had departed with the keys at 6? Who would be served by frightening a woman with a whisper that mentions debt, and then leaving, within reach of the coffin, a cheque that suggests payment to a boatman?" "You put it as if it were meant to be found," I ventured. "Precisely," said Holmes. "An honest criminal does his best to be invisible. An artist sometimes paints too fair a signboard. Come, Inspector, your men will watch here. I must see the vestry, and then the sexton's house. After which, if my nose serves me, we shall make for the river." In the vestry, which was poor and tidy, Holmes examined the keys. Heavy, old-fashioned fellows whose teeth were sharp with recent filing. "He has dressed his stage and dressed his props," he murmured. "Note the fine filings caught in the felt of this tray. Something in the last week." "Elias Prout had the handling of them," the vicar offered. "But he is a punctual creature, was, God rest him." We crossed to the sexton's cottage, where a harried wife received us with red eyes and chafed hands. Holmes's manner, when he pleased, could be as gentle as a woman's. He asked few questions, and those in a tone that drew answers without pain. Prout had been steady, thrifty, and averse to drink. He had spoken in the last days of extra work with the verger's lad, nothing improper, merely the aftermath of Sir Bertram's interment, and the tidying of the neglected North Strip. He had, the wife recalled at last, been proud to show a new Vesta case given him by a gentleman who likes a gait to swing sweet, with which phrase Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. The case was on the mantel. Holmes turned it with a finger. It was of cheap nickel, its knurled edge stained with the same faint blue. "Watson?" "Printer's compound?" suggested. "Or stage grease, indigo tinted to kill glare," said Holmes. "In either case, a man accustomed to colour his hands." When we were once more in the lane, he stood still under the fog and drew 3 deep inhalations, as a hound might before choosing between 2 paths. "The night gives us cover, the river gives us conduct," he said at last. "Lestrade, a cab to Paddington Basin, and quietly. Send one of your men ahead to Onslow Square. Lady Agatha is not to be alone. I fancy we shall discover whether this ferryman carries souls or messages before midnight." "And the debt?" I asked. Holmes's mouth curved without warmth. "We shall see whether the sleeper keeps it, or whether the living are trying to collect." It was past 9 o'clock when our cab rattled away from Briar Lane and plunged into the thicker fog that drifted along the riverside. The air grew heavy with the mingled odours of tar, damp rope, and the faint brine of the incoming tide. Holmes sat forward, the brass ferry token turning idly between his fingers as though he were coaxing it to confession. "Number 37, he murmured, half to himself. "Limehouse Reach, a private landing perhaps, or a ferrymaster's ledger, and Blue Grease, our colourist again. We are closing the circle, Watson." I could see little through the window but the blurred lamps swinging in mist and the ghostly reflection of my companion's keen profile. "You believe the killer to be a boatman?" "Not precisely. A craftsman of sound, perhaps, a man familiar with distances and materials who could contrive that whisper. Yet he uses the river as one uses a wire to conduct his mischief unseen. Remember, the canal at St. Cuthbert's runs directly into the basin. A man with a light skiff could approach within yards of the gate, draw his thread taut across the culvert, and vanish before even a policeman could trace his wake." He paused, tapping his chin. "The trick is as elegant as it is cruel. The poor sexton likely stumbled upon the mechanism, and our conspirator, whether out of fear or necessity, removed him before the discovery could be spread." "You suppose Lady Agatha's fright was deliberate, then? A calculated step in the same design?" "Undoubtedly. The voice from the gate was not intended to terrify her into madness, but into obedience. It carried a message she was meant to ponder. The sleeper keeps his debt, asked the ferryman. A riddle whose answer she alone could supply, were her mind unsettled enough. Someone, Watson, seeks to extract a secret bound to Sir Bertram's grave, and to do so without leaving fingerprints upon the lock. Our cab jolted to a halt upon the slick cobbles of the basin. The fog hung low over the black water, which reflected the lamps as smears of dull gold. A watchman's rattle sounded faintly from across the wharf. Holmes paid the driver, drew his collar close, and strode toward the riverfront with that tireless energy which even cold and hunger could not dull. I followed, my boots sliding in the thin scum of coal dust that coated the stones. At the entrance to Limehouse Ferry, a crooked signboard swayed from a chain. The wooden booth beneath it was lit by a single oil lamp that struggled against the mist. Behind the counter sat a man of indeterminate age, his face as brown and creased as a sailcloth, his eyes sharp despite the drooping lids. He rose as we entered, and I noted the blue stain upon his thumb and forefinger. "Evening, gents," he rasped. "Ferry's closed till tide turns." Holmes's tone was easy and conversational. "A pity. We had hoped to speak with whoever issues your checks. Number 37, for instance." The man's hand went instinctively to his pocket before he caught himself. "Don't know nothing about no numbers, sir. Just carry folk cross when there's coin." Holmes set the token upon the counter. The man's gaze flicked to it and back again. "Where did you come by that?" he asked, too quickly. "In a place where the dead rest quietly, most of them," said Holmes. "You recognize it, then?" The ferryman hesitated, then shrugged. "We gives them to regulars what pay by the month. That one's old, belonged to a gent used to cross after hours, nice spoken, liked his privacy. Ain't seen him these 3 weeks." "Describe him." The man scratched his stubbled jaw. "Tallish, clean face, bit of a stoop, wore gloves even in summer, paid in silver. Sometimes had a case like an artist's box. I reckoned he did maps or such like." "Did he give a name?" "Called hisself Mr. Keene. Fittin' enough, I'd say." Holmes's eyebrow twitched almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Keene. A name chosen with irony. And his destination?" "Other side of the basin. Old printworks what's been closed these 2 years. Nobody goes there now but rats and cats." He had a key to the water-gate, though. Slipped in and out, quiet as a fish. Holmes thanked him gravely, pressed a coin into his palm, and stepped back into the fog. "Come, Watson, the stage grows visible. A colourist, you said. An artist's box, indigo stains, carbolic and paraffin. A print works would serve admirably for our acoustician. Ink, grease, and silence, all under a roof. No constable would trouble." We crossed by a narrow bridge where the planks creaked underfoot. Beyond it rose the hulking silhouette of a warehouse, its windows blind, its door sealed with boards. Holmes produced a small lamp and shaded it carefully. "Observe," he said, pointing to the lower hinge of the water-gate. "Our friend favours his trademark, a touch of fresh oil mixed with grit. He was here tonight." The gate yielded to his deft manipulation. Within lay a long corridor leading to the main hall of the old press-room. The air reeked of ink and damp. Our footfalls echoed dully on the boards. In the far corner, a small furnace glowed, its embers faint but alive. Holmes extinguished his lamp and crouched low. "Someone works here still," he whispered. "Stay by the wall." We advanced silently. Near the furnace stood a bench strewn with tools, spools of silk thread, coils of fine wire, small tins labelled indigo composition and acoustic wax. Upon the wall hung a series of drawings, cross-sections of gates, hinges, and pulleys. At their centre was a diagram unmistakably depicting the Lich Gate of St. Cuthbert's. Beneath it, in bold hand, were written the words, "Phase 1, test successful." Holmes's eyes gleamed. Our whisperer indeed, but what is his goal? He examined a heap of correspondence beside the plans. One envelope bore the crest of the Vance family, another was addressed to B. Vance, Esquineurs, and dated 2 months prior. The handwriting, though disguised by a clerk's neatness, had a certain angular character Holmes did not miss. He compared it with a scrap of note he had pocketed from the vestry register earlier that evening. "The same hand," he murmured. "So Sir Bertram received letters from this place before his death. The debt was his then, and the ferryman his confederate or creditor." Before I could reply, a faint creak sounded above. Holmes's hand shot out in warning. A shadow moved upon the beams, followed by the soft tread of boots. He drew his revolver, and I did likewise. The steps descended the iron stair at the far end. A man appeared in the red glow of the furnace, tall, gaunt, and dressed in a workman's coat streaked with blue. His hair was close-cropped, his eyes hollow, but fierce. He stopped short when he saw us, then spun to flee. Holmes fired a single shot, not to kill, but to shatter the oil lamp beside the door. The flare blinded the fugitive for an instant, and in that instant Holmes was upon him. The struggle was brief and silent. The man fought with the desperation of a trapped animal, but Holmes's wiry strength prevailed. We secured his wrists with a length of silk cord. Under the soot and sweat, his features were refined, the face of an educated man fallen to ruin. Holmes regarded him with that cold curiosity he reserved for specimens rather than foes. "You have the advantage of us," the prisoner said hoarsely, "but I fear you come too late." "To save whom?" Holmes asked quietly. The man's lips twisted. "To save her. She will be gone before dawn." "Lady Agatha?" He said nothing. Holmes's eyes flicked to the table. Among the clutter lay a small case, the twin of the one the ferryman had described. Holmes opened it to reveal a coiled length of wire, a syringe, and a vial half filled with cloudy liquid. He held it to the furnace light. "Prussic acid," he said softly. "Enough to kill a regiment. Watson, fetch Lestrade. No, he is still at Briar Lane. We must act alone. This man speaks truth. There is danger yet." The prisoner gave a hollow laugh. "You think you understand? You see a whisper and a corpse and imagine murder. You do not see the debt. You do not see what Sir Bertram owed." Holmes bent close, his voice low and cutting. "Then enlighten us before the gallows does. What debt binds the living to the dead?" But the man only smiled, a dreadful, resigned smile, and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were dull. He had bitten through the glass vial stopper and swallowed its contents. The stench of bitter almonds filled the air. Within moments, he lay still. Holmes's expression did not change, but his voice, when he spoke, carried an edge I seldom heard. "The fool has taken his secret with him. Yet secrets leave footprints for those who know where to tread." He rose swiftly, scanning the papers once more, then stopped at a folded sheet, half burned, in the furnace's rim. With the tongs, he drew it out. The ink was scorched, but legible enough to read the first lines. "To be delivered upon my death to Lady Agatha Vance. Payment enclosed within the sealed ledger." The rest was gone. Holmes folded the fragment carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "Watson," he said, turning toward the misted doorway, "our path leads back to Onslow Square. The debt has not yet been paid, and if we delay, the ferryman may come to claim another soul before the night is done." The journey back to Onslow Square was one of those silent intervals in which even the rattle of the cab seems to withdraw from notice, leaving only the tension of thought. Holmes sat rigid and unspeaking, his hands steepled before him, the fog-lit streets gliding past like ghosts. I could see that singular concentration gather about him, the kind that marked the hour before his deductions broke from silence into speech. When at last he stirred, it was only to murmur, "Too neat, Watson, far too neat. A whisper, a corpse, a poison swallowed, and a note half burnt. Someone has composed this scene with the precision of a dramatist. You think the man in the printworks was not the true instigator? He was an instrument, nothing more, a craftsman of sound and pigment, yes, but the hand that held the bow was not his. He died too willingly, too conveniently. The truly guilty seldom flee to poison. That is the luxury of servants and martyrs." The cab drew up before Lady Agatha's residence, a dignified structure of grey stone, its windows dark, save for a single lamplight that burned in the upper drawing-room. Holmes motioned for me to follow quietly. The butler admitted us after a short delay, his manner anxious. "Her ladyship has not retired, sir," he said. "She is in the library with Inspector Lestrade. There has been a disturbance." We found them there, Lestrade pacing before the hearth, and Lady Agatha seated rigidly, her pallor heightened against the dark folds of her mourning dress. She started at our entrance. "Mr. Holmes, thank heaven you've come. 10 minutes after you departed, this arrived." She held out a folded sheet, its surface faintly smudged with the same indigo trace we had seen before. Holmes took it without a word and held it beneath the lamplight. The handwriting was the same jagged script that had marked the burned letter from the print works. "The ferryman waits. The debt must be settled before dawn, or the sleeper shall not rest again. Bring the ledger. Come alone." It was signed only with a crude drawing, a circle divided by a horizontal stroke, like an oar across the moon. Holmes's eyes flicked to Lady Agatha. "You have a ledger, then?" She hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. "Yes, my husband kept it in a private drawer, sealed after his death. The solicitor said it contained financial matters too complex for me to judge. I had not even seen it until this afternoon, when the safe was opened for the inventory. It is a thick, red volume, with iron corners. I swear I have not read a line of it." "Where is it now?" "In the study. Locked. Holmes turned to Lestrade. And no one has left or entered the house since. None, save the maid who fetched the constable when this note was delivered. The messenger was a boy, vanished before we could question him. The handwriting's the same, no doubt. Indeed. Holmes tapped the note thoughtfully. Our late friend from the print works was already dead when this was written, which means his employer or accomplice is still at liberty and quite aware of our interference. The letter names the ledger. There lies the heart of this drama. I must see it. Lady Agatha led us into the adjoining study. The fire had burned low, and the only light came from a single, shaded lamp. Holmes examined the desk, the safe, and the lock with swift, minute precision. No tampering, he pronounced. The ledger was produced, a heavy, iron-bound volume with a clasp. He opened it and turned the pages slowly. I glimpsed neat columns of figures, names of companies, transfers of sums between obscure accounts. But near the middle he paused. Ah, here the pattern falters. Watson, observe. These entries are in another hand. The difference was subtle but distinct. The flowing, confident script of Sir Bertram ended abruptly, replaced by a cramped, deliberate imitation. A forgery, I said. Precisely. The later entries conceal payments, large ones, to a name that has been overwritten and erased. Yet see here the impression upon the paper beneath. He held the sheet obliquely to the lamplight. The letters C.H. and the faint trace of a third stroke, perhaps an R or an N, our ferryman again perhaps. Sir Bertram, it seems, was blackmailed. The debt was literal. Lady Agatha clasped her hands. Then my husband, was he deceived? Ruined? Neither, I think. He paid to protect another, and that, my lady, is the secret someone fears you may uncover. Holmes closed the book and stood. Lestrade, I must trouble you for a constable at the rear door. The writer of that note will not risk delay. He expects Lady Agatha to bring the ledger before dawn. If I read his nerve correctly, he will come to fetch it when she does not. Lestrade nodded grimly. You think he'll try the house? I know he will. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar anticipation that was half intellect, half battle-lust. We will oblige him with a reception. The arrangements were swiftly made. Lestrade stationed his men by the doors, while Holmes extinguished all but a single lamp in the study. He placed the ledger upon the desk in plain view, then drew the curtains half closed. The hour crept past midnight. Lady Agatha, though pale and trembling, refused to leave. She sat silently near the hearth while Holmes kept his post by the window, motionless save for the faint flicker of his cigarette. At last the house grew utterly still. The street outside lay wrapped in fog. Then a sound, a faint scrape, the whisper of metal on glass. Holmes's hand lifted, commanding silence. I heard the gentle snap of a latch and the slow slide of a window sash. A shadow moved behind the curtain, paused, and then advanced into the room. The intruder was cautious, deliberate. A man's figure, cloaked and gloved, the face half covered by a scarf. He moved straight toward the desk, his hand reaching for the ledger. In the same instant, Holmes sprang from the shadows and seized him by the wrist. The man wrenched free with startling strength, overturning the lamp. The flame flared, casting the room into violent chiaroscuro, the gleam of steel in his hand, the glint of eyes above the scarf. I caught the outline of a revolver and fired a warning shot that shattered the mantel clock. Lestrade's men burst in from the hall. The intruder spun, fired once, wildly, and then leapt through the half-open window into the fog. Holmes was after him like lightning. We followed through the garden, over the low wall and into the street beyond. The fog swallowed him utterly, but Holmes ran by sound rather than sight, turning sharply into a narrow mews. A lantern flared ahead, the constable at the rear gate, who shouted and lunged. There was a scuffle, a cry, and then silence. When we reached them, the man lay pinned beneath the constable's knee, his revolver clattering upon the stones. Holmes bent, tore away the scarf, and drew a sharp breath. "By heaven, Watson, do you recognize him?" I did not, but Lady Agatha, who had followed despite our protests, uttered a stifled cry. "Mr. Mallory," she gasped, "my husband's solicitor." The man glared up at her, his composure shattered. "You should have brought the ledger, madam," he hissed. "You know nothing of the game you meddle in." Holmes straightened slowly, the faintest glimmer of satisfaction touching his features. "Ah, yes, the game. And yet it was you who moved the pieces from the first, Mr. Mallory. The whisper, the false entries, the counterfeit hand, all arranged so that your theft might be buried with your employer." Mallory's face twisted. "You cannot prove it." Holmes smiled faintly. "I do not need to prove it to you. The ferryman has already paid your fare." He gestured to the constable. "Take him inside. There are questions yet unanswered, but the pattern is complete enough for one night." As the door closed upon the prisoner, Lady Agatha turned to Holmes, her voice unsteady. "You mean he murdered that poor man in the churchyard?" "Indirectly," Holmes replied. "He employed others to do his delicate work. When those tools broke, he destroyed them. And when the last turned dangerous, he wrote his own epitaph. But rest assured, my lady, the dead whisper no more." He looked once toward the fog-dimmed street where the echo of pursuit still lingered, then back to the warm lamplight within. "Come, Watson, we have earned a few hours' peace. The remainder of this tale will unfold with the dawn, and with it, the truth of the debt that bound a sleeping man to his grave." The morning broke wan and colourless, as though London itself had not yet roused from the fog of the previous night. The lamps in Onslow Square guttered and smoked against a sky like tarnished silver. Holmes had not slept. I found him seated at the writing table, his long fingers steepled under his chin, the red-bound ledger open before him. Lestrade had departed to lodge his prisoner at Scotland Yard, promising to return when the morning's statements could be taken. Lady Agatha had been persuaded at last to rest in her room, though I doubted she would find sleep any more easily than Holmes. He did not look up as I entered. "Watson," he said quietly, "have you ever reflected on how seldom evil confines itself to the act that names it? Theft becomes deceit, deceit becomes murder, and all because one man imagines he may close a door upon consequence. Mr. Mallory was such a man." "You are certain of his guilt, then?" I asked, drawing a chair beside him. "As certain as I am that the fog will lift at noon," he replied. "And yet, as with that fog, I cannot yet tell what shape the city will reveal beneath. There remains a point, or several, which trouble me. For instance, why did Mallory choose such elaborate means to frighten Lady Agatha? Why not simply take the ledger once Sir Bertram was dead?" "He feared suspicion." "Suspicion he could have borne, exposure never. The ledger held not only his forgeries, but the record of a debt that implicated more than one name. No, Watson, this business extends beyond Onslow Square." He turned a page, revealing an entry I had not noticed before. "Transfer Vance Estate Holdings to C.H. Reclamation, £3,000. The date preceded Sir Bertram's death by 2 weeks. Holmes tapped it with a forefinger. C.H. Reclamation, our mysterious initials. And observe, the figure is identical to that withdrawn from the family account the very morning Sir Bertram was found dead. The money vanished into a shell company. Who established it?" "Mr. Mallory, He expected to control both ends of the transaction once the estate passed into Lady Agatha's hands. The whispering of debts and ferrymen was meant to drive her into surrendering what papers he could not forge. He closed the book gently and rose, stretching his lean frame with a faint grimace. Nevertheless, there is one thread I have not yet drawn tight. Mallory's accomplice in the print works was too skilled a technician to be a mere labourer. He knew the manipulation of sound, of gases, of chemical cleansing. Such men do not spring from dust. I mean to discover where he learned his craft. I followed him out into the chill morning air, the mist clinging low along the pavement. "To the yard?" I asked. "No, to Fleet Lane first. There is a registry there for industrial patents, one that keeps records of all workshops applying for chemical licenses. Our blue pigment and carbolic mixture were not improvised. They were manufactured. If Mallory's associate purchased them, we may yet find his true name." The hansom rattled through half-empty streets until the steeple of St. Bride's rose through the thinning haze. Holmes moved among the ledgers of the registry with his habitual precision, asking brief, exacting questions. After half an hour, he beckoned me over, his eyes alight with that electric spark that heralded discovery. "Here it is. Charles Henrik, registered as an independent chemist, formerly of the Royal Acoustic Laboratory, dismissed 4 years ago for unethical experiments. His mark, ECH, matches our ledger entry." "And the ferryman's initials," I said. "Just so, our whispering engineer and Mallory's partner. Henrik provided the mechanism, Mallory the motive and the means, a convenient alliance until payment was due." He slipped the document into his pocket. "Lestrade must know of this at once, but first we shall verify whether Henrik's name still carries an address." It did. A modest lodging in Shadwell near the docks. The journey thither carried us into the ragged underbelly of the city, where the air reeked of fish and coal smoke, and the cries of hawkers echoed between leaning buildings. Holmes moved through it like a hound on scent, his eyes darting from one signboard to another until he stopped before a narrow doorway with a tarnished brass plate. "C. Henrik, chemist." The windows were shuttered. He tested the latch. It yielded. Inside, the dim room bore the stale odour of oil and varnish. A table, littered with glass retorts and tubing, dominated the space. Holmes struck a match, its flare revealing an array of small vials, notebooks, and, more ominously, a series of neatly labelled tins: acoustic wax, resonant thread, and carbolic compound. Holmes examined the notebooks with quick precision. "See here, Watson, the notes on his voice conduit. He records experiments on transmitting whispers through silk threads of varying tension. The churchyard mechanism was the final design. But what's this? The last entry is dated 2 nights ago after the man in the print works died." "Then he's alive?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Alive and continuing his work. He speaks here of a second test, canal mouth before the tide turns, ledger secured by ferryman's oath. That, my dear Watson, was written less than 12 hours ago." The conclusion was inescapable. Mallory had been only one actor. Henrik remained at large. Holmes pocketed the notebook and turned for the door. "To the canal, then, before the tide erases his trail." By the time we reached Briar Lane once more, the church bell of St. Cuthbert's was tolling noon. The fog had lifted, revealing the sullen gleam of the water and the dark mouth of the culvert that led beneath the churchyard. Holmes halted on the embankment, scanning the muddy ground. There, footprints leading down to the tunnel. One man, moving in haste, and see the drag mark. Something heavy pulled behind him. We followed the trail cautiously along the narrow ledge that flanked the canal. The air grew colder, rank with damp stone. From within the culvert came a faint, rhythmic tapping, like the echo of a chisel upon metal. Holmes motioned for silence, then advanced, crouching. As our eyes adjusted to the gloom, we saw a figure kneeling beside the water, working feverishly at the base of the wall. His hands were bare, stained blue. Beside him lay an open case and the familiar brass token stamped "Ferry." Holmes stepped forward into the faint light. "Mr. Henrik, I believe? You have misplaced a partner." The man froze, then turned. His face was thin and hollow-cheeked, his eyes fever-bright. "You should not have come," he whispered. "The sleeper keeps his debt. No one can silence him now." Holmes's tone was calm, almost pitying. "It is you who made him speak, Henrik. You and Mallory. But the experiment is over. Come quietly, and you may yet keep your life." Henrik's gaze flicked to the vial beside him, a twin to the one the dead craftsman had carried. Holmes saw the motion and lunged, but too late. With a wild laugh, Henrik flung the vial into the canal, where it shattered with a hiss that filled the air with the sharp scent of acid and gas. The water boiled where it fell, sending up a choking vapour. In the confusion, Henrik bolted into the tunnel. We pursued, the echo of our steps mingling with his retreat. The passage twisted upward to the rear of the churchyard, where a rusted gate gave way beneath his weight. He stumbled out onto the grass, and there, beneath the very lich gate that had whispered doom to Lady Agatha, Holmes overtook him. They struggled briefly until Lestrade's men, summoned by our earlier message, closed in from the lane. Henrik collapsed, spent. Holmes stood over him, breathing hard. "You see, Mr. Henrik," he said, "the dead are poor correspondents. They whisper only what the living teach them, and you have taught them enough." Henrik's eyes darted wildly between us and the vault beyond. "It was all for proof," he gasped. "Sound made visible, death made to speak. Mallory promised the funds, the name, the glory. I only wanted—" His voice broke. "But it called back. It called from the coffin." Holmes regarded him gravely. "Echoes, nothing more. You created the ghost that frightened your own soul. Take him, Lestrade." As they led him away, the sun at last pierced the fog, and a single beam fell across the gate's ironwork. Holmes watched it thoughtfully. "A fitting close," he murmured. "The whisper has spent itself, and the ferryman has claimed his own passage." He turned to me with the faintest smile. "Come, Watson, we have followed the voice to its source. Let us see if London will permit us silence again, for a day or two at least." The afternoon light was already paling when we returned to Baker Street. The long ordeal of the past night and morning seemed to hang in the air, pressing upon the very walls like the residue of fog. Mrs. Hudson had laid out tea, but Holmes ignored it. He went straight to the mantelpiece, removed his coat, and stood before the fire in that rigid pose I had come to know, a man coiled inward, his mind racing ahead while his body waited for it to arrive. I seated myself opposite, the fatigue of pursuit heavy in my limbs, yet my curiosity still sharpened by the incompleteness of the affair. Lestrade had taken Henrik into custody, and the immediate danger to Lady Agatha was past. Yet even as the police led the man away, I had sensed a lingering disquiet in Holmes, a faint shadow of doubt that no arrest could dispel. Now, in the familiar quiet of our rooms, I saw that doubt crystallizing behind his grey eyes. "Watson," he said at last, "does it strike you as odd that neither Mallory nor Henrik ever spoke of the sum itself, the £3,000, except in the vaguest manner? Not a word as to its purpose, its destination, or its supposed debt." "I assumed it was the price of silence," I said. "Blackmail is rarely conducted in itemized accounts." Holmes's lip twitched. "Indeed, Yet blackmail thrives on evidence, not vagueness. Mallory forged accounts. Henrik contrived machinery. But the true payment, its cause, and its creditor remain elusive. Both men were expendable. Someone else played them as one plays pawns on a board. When the pieces had served their use, they were swept away. You suspect a third party? I am certain of it. Mallory possessed the ledger. Henrik provided the means of coercion. But the orchestration, that belongs to subtler hands. A mind that understood Lady Agatha's vulnerability, Sir Bertram's reputation, and the precise nerve to touch in each of his servants. Look again at the pattern, the whisper, the symbol of the ferryman, the invocation of debt, elements chosen not merely to terrify, but to compel obedience. That symbolism suggests a classical education. Henrik was a chemist, Mallory a solicitor. Neither had the temperament for such theatre. He turned suddenly to the table and began sorting through a heap of papers Lestrade had sent from the yard. Henrik's notebooks, Mallory's letters, and the charred fragment from the print works. Here, for instance, he continued, pointing to the faint crest embossed upon the edge of the burned paper. A trident. You may recall it, Watson. It is the emblem of the Mercantile Maritime Bank. The same bank that held Sir Bertram's accounts, I exclaimed. Precisely, and whose board included a certain Lord Klein, Sir Bertram's former business partner. You will find his signature in the ledger's early entries. He retired from public life 2 years ago, ostensibly for reasons of health, but I recall whispers of financial irregularity hushed up by powerful friends. Suppose, then, that Sir Bertram discovered his partner's misdeeds. Suppose, further, that he held written proof of them, which he threatened to reveal unless restitution were made. Would it not explain the phrase, "the sleeper keeps his debt"? The debt was moral as well as financial. Klein's ruin would mean scandal. Thus others acted in his stead to recover or destroy the evidence. I stared at him in admiration. Then Mallory and Henrik were merely instruments, Klein's hired agents? Not directly. Klein is too proud, too cautious. He would not dirty his hands, but there are intermediaries in such circles, discreet men who deal in silence. We shall call upon one presently. He glanced at the clock. 5:30. If my deduction is correct, we have an hour before our man grows uneasy. Where are we bound? To the bank itself. A whisper may die, but a banker's record never does. Within the hour we were descending the broad marble steps of the Mercantile Maritime Bank, whose gilt letters caught the fading light. The clerks were preparing to close, but at Holmes's card, and the mention of Lord Klein's name, the manager, a sleek, careful man with pinched lips, ushered us into his office. Holmes wasted no time on pleasantries. "Mr. Felden," he began, "I represent the estate of the late Sir Bertram Vance. There are irregularities in the accounts between his holdings and a certain subsidiary, C.H. Reclamation. I require the transfer records for the past 6 months. The manager's composure faltered. "Those accounts are sealed, sir. Confidential." Holmes's smile was thin. "Then allow me to assist your memory. The company was created under your direction at Lord Klein's instruction to receive funds from Sir Bertram's estate. The signature on the charter, though written by your clerk, is in your hand." Felden's face drained of colour. "You have no proof." Holmes drew from his pocket the brass ferry token and placed it on the desk. "On the contrary, here is your proof, transmuted from symbol into substance, the ferryman's oar upon the coin, the trident upon your correspondence, both branches of the same heraldry, Klein's own. You may either confirm the connection voluntarily, or I shall place this matter before Scotland Yard within the hour." The man's resistance crumbled. He sank into his chair, dabbing at his brow. I knew nothing of murder," he stammered. "I was instructed only to transfer the funds to cover of the loss from Lord Klein's private investments." Holmes finished smoothly. And when Sir Bertram demanded repayment, you engaged Mallory to quiet him, using Henrik's inventions as your instrument of fear. When that failed, you ordered both silenced. Felden buried his face in his hands. It was not meant to go so far. Klein swore it should be harmless, a little fright to the widow, but Henrik was unhinged. He would not stop. Holmes regarded him with cold precision. And yet you paid him until yesterday. Felden made no reply. Holmes turned away. Watson, note the time and date of each transfer. They will hang higher heads than his before we are done. As we stepped once more into the gathering dusk, I could not restrain myself. Holmes, this is monstrous. Klein, an English peer, a man of Parliament, behind such villainy. Holmes's voice was grave. Villainy, my dear Watson, is no respecter of rank, but do not expect to see him in the dock. Men like Klein arrange their retreats long before the first shot is fired. He drew his coat closer. Still, I would not have him slip away unacknowledged. We shall call upon Lady Agatha tonight. She deserves to hear the truth before it reaches the papers. When we arrived once more at Onslow Square, the lamps within were already lit, and Lady Agatha awaited us with that composed dignity which grief could not wholly extinguish. Holmes recounted the story with quiet clarity, the forged accounts, the conspiracy, the manipulation of her fears. She listened without interruption, only pressing her hands together until the knuckles whitened. "So my husband died for honour," she said at last. "He sought to right another man's wrong, and they silenced him." Holmes bowed his head. "You may take comfort, my lady, that his name will not be stained. The evidence is secure." She gave a faint, tragic smile. "And the ferryman?" "Paid in full," said Holmes. "He will ferry no more souls." When we took our leave, the fog was rising again, softening the gaslight into halos. Holmes paused at the corner, glancing back toward the silent house. "It is strange, Watson," he said quietly. "For all our inquiries into the whispers of the grave, it is the living who speak most deceitfully. The dead, at least, keep faith." He hailed a cab, and as it bore us away through the mist-veiled streets, I could not help but feel that though the case was closed, its echo would linger, like a faint voice carried on the London fog, whispering of debts that neither life nor death could wholly repay. The following morning dawned pale and still, the city muffled beneath a dense veil of mist that clung to the eaves and chimneys like shrouds. I found Holmes already awake, seated cross-legged upon the hearthrug with the morning papers strewn about him. His teacup lay forgotten beside a heap of tobacco ash, and his expression bore that distant intensity I had come to associate with the final throes of deduction. He looked up as I entered, his eyes bright with the peculiar energy that always preceded the unravelling of a mystery's last thread. "You rise late, Watson," he said without reproach. "I have been reading the obituaries. Always instructive. They reveal much about the living." "Obituaries?" I repeated, puzzled. He handed me a folded column from the Times. The headline read, "Sudden Death of Lord Klein. Heart failure at his residence in Richmond." Below followed a brief notice. "The Right Honourable Lord Klein passed away suddenly at his home last night. His lordship had been in declining health. The family requests privacy at this time." I read it twice before looking up. "Then it's finished," I said. "He has escaped all consequence." Holmes's mouth tightened. "So it would appear, though I have seldom seen a more punctual demise. The coincidence is so neat as to offend reason. Klein's death follows within 12 hours of our conversation with his agent. His lordship may have feared exposure, or someone feared it for him." "You believe he was murdered?" "Perhaps, or perhaps self-administered justice." Either way, the pattern continues. Each hand in this affair removes itself as neatly as a surgeon excising rot from tissue. Mallory by bullet, Henrik by his own poison, and now Klein by a heart too obliging. Yet, Watson, there remains something unsatisfied in the matter, an undertone unresolved. He rose abruptly, pacing the room. You will recall Lady Agatha's remark last night, that her husband died for honour. I have pondered those words. Honour implies not only conscience, but sacrifice. And what, pray, did Sir Bertram sacrifice? His fortune? His life? Yes, but for whose sake? I suspect the answer lies not entirely within the bank's ledgers. Before I could answer, a sharp rap sounded upon the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram upon a tray. Holmes tore it open. His eyes flicked rapidly over the message, and a rare light of satisfaction crossed his features. From Lestrade, he said. The inquest upon Henrik produced one unexpected discovery. Among his effects was found a sealed envelope addressed to Lady Agatha Vance, but undelivered. The police, believing it evidence, retained it. Lestrade has it now at the yard. We shall fetch it at once. Within half an hour, we were seated once more in Lestrade's small office, overlooking Whitehall. The inspector greeted us with his usual mixture of respect and self-satisfaction. "You'll not be disappointed, Mr. Holmes," he said, unlocking a drawer. "This here letter was found in the lining of Henrik's coat. No stamp, no date, just her ladyship's name. We haven't broken the seal." Holmes examined it briefly. The envelope was of fine cream paper, unfranked and slightly smudged, with blue pigment at one corner. He broke the seal with the tip of his penknife and unfolded the single sheet within. The handwriting was cramped but precise, the same hand we had seen in Henrik's notebooks. He read in silence, his brows lifting as he went. At last he passed it to me. The message was brief but startling. "My lady, Sir Bertram's honour was not his alone. He sought to shield you from knowledge of a debt that was yours by inheritance. The fortune you hold came from the ruin of others. I have done what I was commanded, yet pity moves me to warn you, destroy the ledger before the ferryman returns, or he will claim more than one soul." C.H. When I looked up, Holmes was gazing out the window, his expression unreadable. "So," I said slowly, "the debt was not merely financial, it touched her as well." "Precisely. The clue was before us all along. Klein's manipulation of the bank masked an older corruption, one buried within the Vance fortune itself. Sir Bertram, discovering that his family's wealth was founded upon fraud or exploitation, sought to repair the wrong quietly. When he failed, he bore the guilt alone. Klein feared exposure, Mallory feared poverty, and Henrik, well, he feared his own conscience. But Lady Agatha, she was the true inheritor of the debt." Holmes turned, his gaze sharpening. "Tell me, Watson, do you recall how Lady Agatha said the whisper seemed to come from the air itself, as if the words were made in the air?" There was more truth in that than she imagined. The whisper was not only a device of sound, but an echo of guilt passed from one generation to the next. I frowned. But why warn her to destroy the ledger? Surely that would conceal the crime, not amend it. Holmes's lips curved in a faint smile. "Ah, my dear friend, that is the moralist's view, not the strategist's. Henrik, though a villain by act, retained a glimmer of humanity. He knew that the ledger, in unwise hands, could ruin the innocent along with the guilty. His warning was both confession and protection. Yet it tells us something else, that someone besides Klein remained to collect the debt. Another accomplice? Not precisely a beneficiary. The phrase "before the ferryman returns" suggests continuation. There was someone who commanded Henrik, someone he still feared. He turned to Lestrade. "Did you examine the contents of Henrik's safe at the station?" "Every paper," Lestrade replied. "Nothing of note, save a small card case containing an address written on the back of a ferry ticket." Holmes's eyes brightened. "And that address?" "An old warehouse near Blackfriars. We thought it part of his trade." "Trade indeed," Holmes murmured. "Lestrade, I must trouble you for that card." Minutes later, we were once again in a hansom cab, the city blurring past beneath a low sky heavy with soot. Holmes was silent, absorbed in thought. I watched him in profile, every muscle alert, the fingers of one hand drumming against his knee in that peculiar rhythm that always marked the culmination of his reasoning. We arrived at the warehouse shortly before noon. It stood derelict by the river, its windows boarded and its door padlocked. Holmes produced a slender pick from his pocket and made short work of the lock. Inside, the gloom was cut only by a shaft of pale light through a gap in the roof. The air smelled faintly of oil and salt. At first glance, the place seemed empty. Then Holmes stooped, lifting a fragment of cloth from the floor, a woman's glove, black silk, its fingers damp from the river air. "Not long left here," he said. "See, the fabric still holds warmth. Watson, we are not alone." Even as he spoke, a faint sound echoed from beyond the partition, a rustle, the creak of a board. Holmes moved swiftly toward it, motioning for silence. We turned the corner together, and there, standing by a crate half open to the water, was Lady Agatha Vance. Her face was pale but composed, her gloved hands resting upon the iron-bound ledger that lay within the crate. She looked up at Holmes without surprise, as though she had expected him. "You should not have followed me," she said quietly. "It was my husband's wish that this end with us." Holmes regarded her steadily. "You came to destroy the ledger." "Yes, it bears my family's sin, Mr. Holmes. To expose it would bring ruin to many who are blameless now." "And yet," he said softly, "you came here alone, to the very place your enemies used for their crimes. Did you truly believe the ferryman would not return?" She smiled faintly, a shadow of sorrow in it. "Perhaps I hoped he would. Some debts are too old to pay in coin." The words had scarcely left her lips when a figure stirred in the shadows behind the crate. A flash of motion, a gleam of steel. Holmes lunged forward, but too late. The assailant's blade caught the light as it descended. I fired once. The shot rang through the rafters, echoing like a tolling bell. The figure collapsed, sprawling into the water below. When the echoes died, Lady Agatha stood motionless, one hand clutching her side where the blade had grazed her. Holmes caught her before she fell, easing her into the light. "It is over," he said gently. "The ferryman has claimed his final fare." She looked up at him through half-lidded eyes. "Tell me, will the dead rest now?" Holmes's expression softened. "Yes, my lady, the whisper is ended." Her head rested against his arm, her breathing slow but steady. Outside, the river rolled on in silence, carrying away the last echoes of that fatal debt. Lady Agatha's wound proved shallow, more shock than substance, yet the faint loss of blood and her exhaustion made the scene all the more fragile. Holmes lifted her gently from the cold floor and laid her upon a packing tarp near the wall, where the slanting light from the roof's fissure bathed her pale face in a soft, spectral glow. I tore a strip from my handkerchief and bound the small gash at her side. The bleeding ceased within moments. Her eyes opened again, steady now, and when she spoke, her voice carried both weariness and an unexpected calm. "It seems even the grave cannot keep silence long," she murmured. Holmes's face softened slightly, though his mind, I could see, had not rested. He glanced toward the shattered plank near the water where the assailant had fallen. The river below gave no sign of its secret. "The man is gone," he said quietly. "The current has claimed him, but not before he left us a final answer." He knelt beside the crate, examining the ledger that had nearly cost so many lives. The brass corners were tarnished, and the binding damp from the spray of the river. One corner of the cover had been pried loose, revealing a false compartment beneath the spine. From this hidden space, Holmes drew a folded sheet of vellum and a small, rusted key attached to a faded ribbon. The moment he saw the paper, his expression changed from alertness to that grave concentration which marked a revelation long anticipated. "Watson," he said softly, "the last chapter of our whisper?" Lady Agatha stirred. "You mean there is more?" Holmes met her gaze, not unkindly. "Much more, my lady, and perhaps not all of it welcome, but truth seldom arrives with kindness in its train." He unfolded the vellum. The writing, faded but legible, bore the same careful hand as Sir Bertram's own business correspondence. Holmes read aloud, "To whomsoever finds this, know that I, Bertram Vance, do acknowledge a debt, not of coin, but of conscience. My fortune was built upon the ruin of others through ventures disguised by honourable names. I sought to repair it, yet my efforts were opposed. Should I fail, let the enclosed key unlock what remains of my confession in the vault beneath the old chapel of St. Cuthbert's, wherein the truth is sealed. The rest God must judge." Holmes folded the paper slowly, as though handling a relic. So the whisper was not merely a ploy to extort, but an echo of Sir Bertram's own remorse. Someone discovered this confession and turned it to their own ends. Lady Agatha's eyes filled, though her voice remained steady. "My husband carried that burden alone. And She broke off, pressing her hand to her brow. "He never spoke of it. He only said that peace required silence." Holmes looked toward the river, his tone more reflective than before. "Silence is a poor substitute for peace. The two are seldom the same." Outside, faintly, came the sound of boots on the quay, Lestrade's voice barking an order. A moment later he appeared through the doorway, flanked by constables. "We found the fellow's coat floating downstream," he said. "Whoever he was, he won't trouble anyone again. Missed the devil's own catch by inches." Holmes rose. "You may order a search when the tide falls, Inspector, but it is the papers that matter now. This," he handed over the ledger and the vellum, "will tell you all you need of Lord Klein's transactions. But as for what lies beneath St. Cuthbert's, that must be handled with discretion. The dead have left us a final question, and I intend to hear its answer before the day is out." By dusk we were again before the iron gate of the Vance vault. The air was cold and still, the fog returning in slow drifts that moved like living things between the stones. The vicar met us there, lantern in hand, his face drawn with unease. "Mr. Holmes, are you certain this is wise? The crypt has been sealed since that night." Holmes accepted the lantern. "It is time, Reverend. We have the key, and the truth is overdue." The vault opened with a reluctant groan, exhaling the same sterile air we had encountered before. Holmes descended first, his lean figure half lost in the gloom. I followed with the lantern, the light falling across the coffins and the damp stone walls. At the far end, beneath the family crest, stood a small iron chest inset into the masonry. The ribboned key fit perfectly. Holmes turned it once, twice, and the lock yielded with a click. Inside lay a bundle of documents, some so old their ink had faded to ghost grey, others fresher, clearly the additions of Sir Bertram himself. Holmes unfolded the topmost page, scanned it briefly, and then handed it to me. It was a deed of partnership, naming Sir Bertram Vance and Lord Klein as joint investors in a shipping venture, the Acheron Company, Its profits, the paper declared, were drawn from the acquisition and reclamation of human assets along the West African coast. The words struck me like a physical blow. Good God, I breathed, the slave trade. Holmes nodded grimly. Long after its prohibition, men of wealth found new names for old evils. Reclamation, resettlement, fine phrases for commerce in misery. Sir Bertram, it seems, discovered the full measure of his fortune's stain too late. He tried to undo it, perhaps to return what could be returned. But the others silenced him to preserve their respectability. Lady Agatha had followed us down the steps. The lantern light caught her face as she gazed upon the documents. "Then my husband died seeking atonement," she whispered. And the whisper, "The sleeper keeps his debt," was meant to remind me of what we owed. Holmes replaced the papers carefully in the chest and closed it. "The debt is paid, my lady, not by silence but by acknowledgment. Scotland Yard will see justice done for those still living, and history will record the rest. Sir Bertram's honour lies not in his wealth, but in the effort to cleanse it." She bowed her head. "Then let the truth be known, Mr. Holmes. Whatever shame it brings, it will not be greater than the lie we have lived beneath." Holmes inclined his head, a rare gesture of respect. "You have more courage than many who wear medals for it." As we left the vault, the church bell began to toll the hour. Its echo rose through the fog like the fading voice of the very whisper that had begun the affair. Holmes paused at the gate, his eyes upon the river beyond. "Strange, is it not, Watson?" he said quietly. "How guilt can ripple through generations like a sound carried upon still water. It begins as a whisper, but sooner or later it finds an ear." The fog thickened then, swallowing the last glimmer of daylight. We walked back toward the waiting cab, the lantern's glow our only guide. Behind us the bell fell silent, and the wind stirred faintly through the yews, as though the city itself exhaled after long restraint. That night, as I sat once more in our rooms at Baker Street and Holmes turned again to his violin, the melancholy notes carried me back to that graveyard gate, to the whisper that had roused the dead and laid the living bare. The melody wound low and mournful, fading at last into silence. And I knew, as he did, that though the case was closed, its echo would remain, like the ghost of a debt finally spoken aloud. The fire burned low in the grate that evening, its faint glow catching upon the brass fittings of Holmes's chemical instruments and lending our familiar sitting room an oddly contemplative air. The events at St. Cuthbert's had left both of us subdued. Lady Agatha had returned home under Lestrade's escort, pale but unbroken, while the inspector himself remained behind to secure the vault and its documents for official custody. Now, hours later, Holmes sat in his armchair, his eyes half closed and his fingers steepled beneath his chin, a posture I had learned to associate with the moment when the intellect retreats into silence, not for rest, but for reckoning. Outside, the fog had thickened once more, pressing like a living thing against the panes. The occasional clip-clop of hooves drifted up from Baker Street, dull and distant. I turned over in my mind the grim discoveries of the day, the forged accounts, the murdered accomplices, the buried confession, and could not suppress a shudder at the magnitude of deceit concealed beneath so thin a veneer of respectability. At length I broke the silence. "It is difficult to believe, Holmes, that so vile a traffic could have survived into our own century under the name of commerce. To think that men of title and honour—" "Titles, my dear Watson," he interrupted quietly, "are but disguises stitched by society. They conceal the same frailties we encounter daily in thieves and murderers, greed, fear, and vanity. Yet, he added after a pause, it is not the crime itself that lingers in my thoughts, but the whisper that carried it to light. I looked up. You mean Henrik's contrivance? Not merely the device, said he, opening his eyes and fixing them upon the embers. There was a second whisper, one not of sound but of conscience. It began with Sir Bertram's remorse, passed through Mallory's hands, through Henrik's delusion, and ended in Lady Agatha's awakening. Each heard it differently, but all were compelled by the same unseen voice, the truth itself, insisting upon being known. He rose and crossed to the mantel, where the brass ferry token lay beside the pipe-rack. Picking it up, he turned it between his fingers, the faint engraving of the oar glinting in the firelight. The ferryman, he mused, an image as old as mankind's first fear of death. Yet in this case the metaphor was inverted. The living were those who owed passage, not the dead. They ferried guilt across generations until the weight of it drew them under. He replaced the coin and stood motionless for a moment before resuming his seat. Still, he continued, there remains one loose thread, and you know how I detest an untidy skein. I leaned forward. Surely all is accounted for. The accomplices are dead, the evidence secure. What could remain? The assailant at the warehouse, said Holmes with that sharp gleam which so often heralded revelation. You will recall, Watson, that his face was never seen. He fell into the river and vanished, yet the current at that point runs toward the lock, not the open Thames. The body should have surfaced by now, and Lestrade has received no report. I suspect our ferryman may yet be among the living. I felt an involuntary chill. Then who was he? That, my dear fellow, is precisely what I intend to learn. Before I could reply, there came a brisk knock upon the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram upon her salver. Holmes tore it open, his expression darkening as he read. He handed it to me without a word. The message, sent from the Richmond Constabulary, was brief. Body recovered near Mortlake, identified as Lord Klein. Marks upon neck suggest violence. Investigation requested. I looked up in astonishment. But Klein was said to have died of heart failure. An error of courtesy, Holmes said grimly. The upper circles of society prefer euphemism to truth. Murder wears a gentler mask when draped in decorum. Fetch your coat, Watson. We leave for Richmond at once. The journey was long and silent, the cab wheels hissing through the fog. At last, we arrived before the ivy-clad gates of Klein's estate, where a solitary constable stood guard. He led us through a side entrance to the study, a sombre, panelled chamber heavy with the scent of cedar and decay. Upon a chaise near the hearth lay the body of Lord Klein, his face ashen, the neck bearing faint bruises in the shape of a cord. Holmes bent over him, examining the marks with the precision of a surgeon. No sign of struggle, he murmured. No forced entry, no disorder in the room. Whoever did this was admitted freely, and the deed executed swiftly. Observe the small puncture upon the wrist, Watson. I leaned closer. A needle mark? Precisely. Our culprit used an injection, perhaps a paralytic, to render him helpless before tightening the cord. And note this, no bruising upon the hands. The killer was skilled, practiced. A woman, I should think. A woman? I repeated. He nodded absently, glancing toward the escritoire. The faint scent of jasmine, the displaced cushion upon the chair, the faint indentation upon the rug, where a lighter step stood for some minutes. And here, he opened the blotter, the impression of recent writing. Let us see what sentiment Lord Klein committed to paper before his departure. Using a pencil, Holmes shaded lightly across the blotter, revealing the ghost of a line. Cannot allow her to bear it. She must not know. Holmes straightened slowly, his expression unreadable. The pronoun, Watson. She. There are few women in this matter. Lady Agatha, perhaps, but she was with us when Klein died. Who else stood to lose by the truth's revelation? Someone of his household, I ventured. Possibly. Yet consider Henrik's letter, the warning to Lady Agatha. Destroy the ledger before the ferryman returns. The ferryman, it seems, had many faces. I begin to suspect that this entire affair was sustained not by conspiracy alone, but by sentiment, by the instinct to shield someone dear. He crossed to the window, where the heavy curtains were drawn. Parting them slightly, he gazed out upon the garden, where the moonlight fell ghostly upon the frost-silvered hedges. There is one more visit we must make before I am satisfied. Klein's secretary, Miss Vera Mallory, the late solicitor's daughter. She disappeared the same night her father was arrested. It was near midnight when we reached the small lodging house in Kensington that had served as her residence. The landlady, a nervous woman with a candle trembling in her hand, confirmed that Miss Mallory had returned briefly that morning to collect her belongings, then departed in great agitation, leaving no forwarding address. Holmes examined the room by lamplight. A single trunk remained half-packed. Upon the dresser lay a handkerchief faintly scented with jasmine. "She was here not 6 hours ago," he murmured. "And if I am not mistaken, what's this?" He drew from beneath the trunk a scrap of torn paper. On it were the words, "Meet me where the river bends, midnight." No signature, but beside it a small inked symbol, the oar and circle once more. Holmes folded the scrap carefully. "The ferryman waits again, Watson. The circle closes upon itself. If we are to end this, we must be at that bend before the appointed hour." We left at once, the cab wheels cutting through the mist-laden streets toward the river's edge. The night air was raw and biting, the fog rising in pale wreaths from the water. Far ahead, the faint glow of a lantern flickered near the bend of the bank. "There," Holmes whispered. "Steady now, we may yet be in time." As we approached, two figures came into view, one tall, the other slight. The smaller turned sharply at our approach, the lantern's light falling upon a pale, determined face framed by a dark veil. It was Vera Mallory. In her hand glinted a revolver. Opposite her, motionless and composed, stood a cloaked man whose features the mist still concealed. Holmes's voice cut through the stillness. "Put down the weapon, Miss Mallory. This will serve neither justice nor memory." She started, her gaze wild. "He deserves it!" she cried. "He murdered my father, used him, then cast him aside. The ledger was his order, the whisper his design." The man took a step forward, and the fog lifted enough for me to see his face. It was Lestrade's constable, the very one who had claimed to capture Henrik's accomplice at Onslow Square. Holmes's tone sharpened. "So, the ferryman shows himself at last." The constable's expression twisted into something cold and knowing. "Ferryman or no, Mr. Holmes, debts must be paid, some by coin, others by silence." Before another word could be spoken, the revolver cracked, and the fog swallowed the sound like a closing door. The crack of the revolver echoed like a thunderclap across the river, its sound rolling through the fog and vanishing into the night. I saw Vera Mallory stagger backward, the lantern tumbling from her hand to shatter against the stones. For an instant all was confusion, the hiss of extinguished oil, the smell of gunpowder, and the muffled rush of water against the embankment. Holmes was already in motion, springing forward with the swiftness of a striking hawk. "Watson, your lantern!" he cried, and I obeyed at once, fumbling for the spare light I had brought. Its weak glow flickered to life, revealing a grim tableau. The constable, the false ferryman, stood rigid, the pistol still smoking in his hand. At his feet, Vera lay half upon the stones, half upon the mud, her dark veil fallen aside. A crimson stain was spreading fast through the folds of her cloak. Holmes was beside her in an instant, one hand pressing against the wound, while the other turned to the constable. "Drop it," he said, coldly. "You have spilled enough blood in the name of debts you scarcely understand." The man hesitated only a fraction, then the pistol clattered to the ground. His face, now fully revealed, was coarse and weathered, but there was no madness in his eyes, only calculation. Holmes regarded him with the detached precision of a surgeon observing a specimen. "I know you," Holmes murmured. "You were Klein's footman once." Joseph Marrow, dismissed for theft, later found in the employ of Henrik. "It was you who carried the notes, who placed the whispering device beneath the vault, who struck the blow at Onslow Square. You have been the ferryman all along, collecting fares for masters now dead." Marrow's lips curled. "Aye," he said hoarsely. "And who pays me now, Mr. Holmes? They're all gone. Klein, Mallory, Henrik, all safe across the river. Only I remain, and I've debts of my own." Vera stirred faintly, her voice a whisper. "He told me my father's death was an accident, that Klein gave the order. I only wanted him to answer." Holmes's tone softened. "You have answered enough, Miss Mallory. Rest now." But she grasped his sleeve with surprising strength. "The papers, in the crate by the river. He meant to sell them, to the bank, to bury it all again." Her fingers tightened once more, then fell away. I saw at a glance that her wound was mortal. The bullet had pierced the lung, her breathing came shallow, each exhale a faint tremor upon her lips. I pressed my handkerchief against the wound, though I knew the futility of it. She looked up at Holmes one final time. "You said, truth insists upon being known. Tell them. Tell her." "My father was not all evil." Holmes inclined his head solemnly. "You have my word." Her eyes closed, and the faint smile upon her lips remained, as the life ebbed from her. The fog drew about us again like a curtain. Holmes rose slowly, his face set in that mask of calm which I knew to be the refuge of a deeply stirred spirit. Lestrade and his men arrived minutes later, their lanterns casting long bars of light through the mist. They took Marrow into custody without resistance, though he spoke no further word. Holmes, meanwhile, retrieved the crate Vera had mentioned. Within lay a packet of documents, ledgers, letters, and signed orders, connecting Klein and the bank's directors to the Acheron Company. The evidence was complete and damning. When all was secured, Holmes stood upon the embankment, his gaze fixed upon the dark current. "Every crime, Watson," he said quietly, "has its undertow. You may trace the ripples backward from the act to the motive, from the motive to the thought, but in the end, the current always leads to the same depth, the human conscience. It pulls at every man differently. Some swim against it, others let it drag them under." I made no reply. There was nothing to add. The constables bore Vera's body away, and we followed in silence until the first pale blush of dawn began to dissolve the fog. Back at Baker Street, the city had awakened, but the world within our rooms felt suspended, an island untouched by the growing noise of the day. Holmes stood at the window, his hands clasped behind him, while I set down the details of the night's grim conclusion. At last he spoke without turning. "Lady Agatha will receive peace of a sort," he said. "Her husband's name will be cleared, his efforts vindicated. The papers we seized will ensure that the bank's guilt is known. Yet no triumph in this case is free from tragedy. The sins of fathers, Watson, how persistently they haunt the living." "You pity her?" I asked. "I pity them all," he replied softly. "Even Marrow. The ferryman's task is never of his choosing. He merely rows where the current demands." He turned then, and I saw a rare weariness in his eyes, the kind that comes not from lack of rest, but from too deep an acquaintance with the darker threads of human motive. "There will be no court trial for Lady Agatha," he went on. "I shall see that the Crown handles her husband's confession privately. The greater good lies in restoration, not spectacle." He took up his violin then, as was his custom when words no longer sufficed. The first notes were low, uncertain, a mourning voice rather than a melody. The tune rose slowly, shaping itself into something like remembrance. I sat listening, watching the pale smoke curl upward from his cigarette in delicate spirals until the last note faded into silence. Days later, the newspapers carried the story in softened tones. "Financial scandal involving late Lord Klein, confession clears the Vance name." There was no mention of Vera Mallory nor of the river's final toll. Holmes did not protest the omissions. He merely folded the paper and set it aside. A week afterward, a small parcel arrived at Baker Street, addressed in a familiar, elegant hand. Inside was a letter from Lady Agatha, and within it the brass ferry token, newly polished, the oar gleaming in the light. "You said the dead keep faith, Mr. Holmes," she had written. "I believe now that you were right. The whisper is gone, but its echo will guide the living. May it remind you that truth, though cruel, is the kindest ferryman of all." Holmes read the letter twice, then placed the token upon the mantel beside his violin. "A fitting end," he murmured. "The river carries away its secrets, but sometimes it returns one small coin for the passage." He reached for his pipe, glancing at me with that faint, sardonic smile that never failed to disarm the heaviness of any mood. "Come, Watson, there is talk of a curious burglary in Cheapside, an affair of stolen church bells, if you can believe it. Let us see whether the living may yet outwit their own ghosts." And with that he was gone, his coat swirling behind him, the fog closing once more about his figure as the morning sun began to break over London, washing the last of the night's shadows from the cobblestones. The whisper from the graveyard gate was silenced at last, but its echo would remain, faint and eternal, in the chronicles of Sherlock Holmes. The days that followed passed with a curious stillness, as if London itself were taking a long, slow breath after the storm. The newspapers soon turned their attention to fresher scandals, the name of Vance receding from their columns as the city's restless memory found other prey. Yet in Baker Street, the echo of that whisper lingered like a faint chord that would not resolve. Holmes, though outwardly the same, carried an air of reflection rare even for him. His violin remained silent, his chemical flasks stood untouched. It was only when I broached the matter directly that he deigned to speak of it at all. "You see, Watson," he began one evening, "there are cases that end in triumph and those that end in truth. The two are seldom the same." He was at the window, the fog wreathing the lamps outside in halos of pale gold. "We uncovered the crime, yes, the deceit, the blackmail, the murders. But in so doing we laid bare a wound older than all of them. Guilt has lineage just as virtue does." I closed my notebook. "And Lady Agatha?" "She has gone to the country," he replied. "Her solicitors have arranged the restitution of what remains of her fortune to the families wronged by her husband's ventures. An admirable gesture. She will find peace, I think, though not happiness. Few survivors of conscience ever do." He turned then, the faintest glimmer of amusement softening his features. "Do you recall what she asked me in the churchyard, whether the dead would rest?" I believe they shall, though not because of any earthly justice. The truth, once spoken aloud, is a kind of absolution in itself. There was a long silence between us, filled only by the steady ticking of the clock and the crackle of the fire. I could not help but think of all who had perished in the affair: Henrik with his mad genius, Mallory with his forged loyalties, Vera Mallory with her final plea for understanding. Each had been drawn by a different current, yet all had been carried to the same dark riverbank where greed and guilt met. At length Holmes rose and took up the small, polished ferry token from the mantel. He held it between finger and thumb, the metal glinting in the firelight. A simple object, he mused, yet how much meaning men can pour into such things. To Henrik it was a symbol of passage, to Lady Agatha of release, to Klein of payment due, and to me, he smiled faintly. Merely evidence, but even evidence, Watson, may acquire poetry in the right light. He slipped the token into his pocket and reached for his hat. I believe the air of London grows stifling. A walk to the river might be in order. Will you join me? We left Baker Street just as twilight was gathering. The city hummed with its usual life, the rumble of carriages, the cries of costermongers, but beneath it all there was a strange sense of quietude, as though some long unsettled account had been balanced at last. Holmes walked quickly, his coat flaring behind him, the brim of his hat low against the wind. When we reached the embankment, he stopped beside the railing and gazed out across the Thames. The water rolled on, black and impenetrable, its surface catching the last glimmer of light. "There lies London's conscience," he said softly. "It hides its sins well, but the current remembers." He drew the ferry token from his pocket, turned it once in his fingers, and then, without ceremony, cast it into the river. The faint splash was swallowed by the flow. "For the ferryman," he said simply. We stood there a moment longer, the fog curling around us like smoke. Then Holmes turned and began the walk back, his step brisk, his posture once more that of the man of reason rather than of reflection. As we neared Baker Street, he spoke again, almost to himself. "The curious thing about guilt, Watson, is that it seeks company. A single wrong begets 1,000 silences. To break one is to free them all." He gave a low chuckle. "And yet I confess, I prefer my ghosts properly at rest. There is enough mystery among the living to keep us both occupied." He glanced at me then, his keen eyes alight once more with that unmistakable spark of purpose. "I received a telegram this afternoon," he said. "Lestrade requests our assistance in a matter at the British Museum, a curator found dead, a locked case, and a vanished artifact. Something to cleanse the palate, perhaps?" I could not help but smile. After this last affair, Holmes, I would welcome a mystery that involves neither graveyards nor ferrymen. "Then let us hope," he replied dryly, "that this one confines itself to the living, though experience suggests otherwise." We mounted the steps to our door, the gaslight burning steadily above. The fog had thinned, the air carrying that curious freshness which follows a long rain. Holmes paused with his hand upon the latch, looking back over the street below. "Strange," he murmured. "The whisper that began in a graveyard ends here, in the heart of London, and still the city sleeps." He pushed open the door, and the familiar warmth of our rooms enveloped us once more. The case of the whisper from the graveyard gate was closed, its mysteries unravelled, its debts paid. Yet as I wrote the final lines of my record that night, I could not shake the sense that somewhere, deep beneath the city's ceaseless motion, the river still whispered, softly, endlessly, of secrets that only Sherlock Holmes could ever hope to hear.